Okay, hello and welcome everyone. Welcome to the last event of this crazy festival day of this Uroboros Monday. This is the 6th event today that we have. Right now we are going to have the Feral Creative Practices panel discussion, or maybe rather a conversation or some kind of a feral chat amongst several creative practitioners who are working in the area of eco-social transformations and who kindly accepted our invitation to chat with us today. And before we start introducing the panel and the panelists and everything else, I will just very clearly, quickly like to mention that the Uroboros Festival has been supported by the Abacus Foundation and by public funds provided by the Slovak Arts Council and by the city of Prague. So we are really thankful to these institutions that they helped us to make this whole 14 days long festival happen. And so a little bit more about the feral conversation that we are going to experience today. This conversation is organized as part of the Feral Creative Practices Festival track that has been curated by the Creatures Project, or Creative Practices for Transformational Futures, as the full title of the project goes, and specifically by 4 creatures, researchers and creative practitioners, namely by Andrea Botero, Kristina Ampacidou, Čes Choi, and myself, Markéta Lejšová. So the 4 of us will act today as co-moderators of some sort, but I guess that we will really let the conversation flow in a rather feral fashion and just ask each other questions about our practices together with the panelists and see where it takes us. And a little bit about the theme of the panel, but also of the whole Feral Creative Practices track. So the theme relates to and sort of sprouted from our shared interest in exploring how creative practices can help foster eco-social transformation and societal change towards more sustainable and regenerative futures. And we are focusing specifically on those creative practices that can be considered as feral, by which we mean that they emerge within human-sponsored frameworks or projects, but they are not entirely under human control. So in this sense, they can be considered as experimental, open-ended, speculative. They are usually participatory. They invite imaginative, co-creative inputs from a diverse pool of more than human contributors. And they are kind of carefully and self-reflectively exploring the human position within the multi-species World Wide Web. So yeah, the festival so far, the Feral Track has presented the work of artists and creative practitioners of diverse backgrounds who have been experimenting with various down-to-earth and craftful modes of co-creation. So just to give you some glimpse, there was, for instance, a workshop that revolved around the DIY bioreactor, which grows spirulina and stories about colonization, and where participants listened to those stories while making hands-on space snacks for an imaginary trip to Mars. There was also a workshop where participants contributed in quite performative ways to a polyvocal glossary of terms related to social change. We also had a session where we collectively imagined how to build a global network of feral altars for new eco-social rituals. And there was also this more than human derive session where we explored the more than human flows of urban data. And we also had a series of 10 eco-divination tarot readings and much, much, much more. I can probably go on for many more minutes. But I would try to stop so we have enough time to talk together today. I think that we should start with introducing the panelists today. So I will pass the floor to Kristina, who will do the introduction.
Thanks a lot, Markéta, and thank you for the introduction, and thanks to all of you for being here and for accepting our invitation for this discussion. I will try to introduce one by one all the speakers, starting with Isabel Beavers, that is a transdisciplinary artist and creative producer based in Los Angeles. She is the one who did the workshop on the wild altars last week. And her work generally explores ecologies and environmental histories and kind of like speculates about different like climate futures through installations and multimedia art. She's currently a resident artist with a cultural hub in LA, and a founder and SciArt ambassador with Super Collider Gallery. Aga Kirova, and I'm sorry if I pronounced this very wrong. She has a background in animated film and computer simulations and physics, but she works hybridly with video, graphic design, and collaborative practices to build eclectic narratives. She is the one that built the bioreactor who grows spirulina, and this is part of a larger project that she is working about, like a human colonization of Mars. And both Isabel and Agnieszka developed their projects as part of Creatures as well. Then we have Fred van Amstel, that he's assistant professor of service design and experience design at the Industrial Design Academic Department of the Federal University of Technology at Paraná in Brazil. His work has been revolving around mapping the contradictions that are faced by architectural design and service design in contemporary practice, and how they can be used productively in order to kind of like expand and harness these contradictions as a source of change. So I'm very curious to ask a bit more about this. And finally, we have Mika Satomi and Hannah Perner-Wilson, who have been working together under the collective name Kobakant. And they explore the use of textile crafts and electronics as a medium for commenting on technological aspects of today's like high-tech society. So they kind of like, they believe that technology should be hacked and subverted, and modified to better fit our personal needs and desires. They have been research fellows at the Distance Lab in Scotland, where they published their online database for sharing their DIY wearable technology approach in the title, How to Get What You Want. And the four moderators that Marketa kindly mentioned in the beginning, we are all working at Creatures as researchers at the Creatures project. Andrea and Marketa, they are based in Helsinki, and they are both researchers at Aalto University, whereas Jazz and I participate at Creatures from the RMIT in Melbourne and also in Barcelona. Jazz is the director of the Careful Design Lab, and Andrea is the Academy Research Fellow at Aalto University. So with that list of introductions, I want to once again welcome you all and maybe ask you to also say a few words about yourselves, and maybe like how you can start by saying a little bit, how do you position your research and practice in the field of socio-ecological practice, and how do you see it contributing to transformation? And maybe like in order of appearance, we can start with Isabel and then move around the table.
Definitely. Thanks, Christina. Thanks everyone too. I'm really excited to be here with you all today from our multiple time zones. But as mentioned, my name's Isabel Beavers. I'm a transdisciplinary artist. I work across many different types of mediums, depending on the project I'm working on. But to talk a little bit more to your question, I really see my practice in my creative practice and my art practice as sort of creating fractures in the way we might understand reality or think about reality or come to know our realities, whether that is through creating an emotional experience in a multimedia installation, bringing someone to a space that they have not gone before and maybe looking at all of the more than human species there in a new way, trying to create moments of dissonance where one can reflect on the way they conceive of the world. Lately, I've been focusing a lot on the act of grieving and mourning in order to allow us to more deeply process what has been happening with the climate crisis. And from that space, hopefully open up a space to create and generate new rituals, new conceptions of what the future could be like and how we can relate ourselves to everything around us, including all the other creatures that we share space with. So yeah, I started out my career in land conservation in the United States. And so a lot of my practice comes from a similar impulse, which is to try to find ways to do better in the future. And I think I'm always looking for new processes, new tools, new ways of thinking, new philosophies and structures to help do that. But then always coming back to the capacity that I find in public and not public art in gallery spaces and museums, sort of any creative experience you have, the capacity that has to create an emotional experience and one where information can be felt with the body rather than through cognition, because I think we're really overloaded with cognitive information. So I'm always trying to create experiences that the body can process that information and hopefully lead to some of these new understandings, or maybe they're not new, but a shift in perspective. Yeah, so before I just repeat myself all over again, I'll pass it on to someone else. I think next was Agnia.
Agnieszka?
Yeah, sorry. I got into the listener mode. To reply to your question, I think I need to go historical here, actually, because I've been, since ever I remember, I've been interested in like open structures. Like I do have, like for years I've been working with open source software, for example, and thinking how open source can be applied beyond IT, basically, what this method could mean farther. And this led me to like interactivity and something which is open for contribution. I started to explore participatory formats of how we can work together, how we can create spaces which are inviting for all people, decentralized structures, horizontal structures, however we call it. And they were those projects, those explorations been revolving around humans, how we can work with people. They would be exploring economical systems, social structures. So this motive also of the structure itself and how we can hack it, how we can rethink it. Something it was yeah, since I remember in my practice very strong. But when you go deeper and deeper, then you think, okay, so where is the border of that, social structure? Where is the border between human and other beings? And I think this led me particularly to work with fermentation, first of all. I don't know how much in detail I should go here, but I've been co-organizing workshops on fermentations as kind of a vehicle for discussion and rethinking how we are, how we work together, how we relate to each other. But then it went farther because I realized, okay, but I am actually collaborating, taking with other humans, taking fermentation and micro world as kind of a company, but we don't really relate to it. And I think now I'm entering some other level where I am actually like, hey, little ones, like what we have here together. So I think it's also about blurring this border between, okay, we are humans and something else is something else, and therefore we cannot relate to each other at all. And we are just these strangers who are maybe seeing the results of our actions, but there is no attempt to really relate to each other beyond that. So it's a journey. It's a journey which came from rethinking various systems, starting from social norms and how we relate together beyond human species, let's say. Is it me who should pick up the next person? Or what's the rule here, actually? How does it work?
There's no rule.
There is no rule.
Okay.
We are testing your memory. You should mention the person that Christina introduced after you. Like in the children games.
Let me choose. No. I want this challenge. Was it Frederick then?
Very You win the challenge.
Yeah,
All right.
what's the award?
So good. Thank you, Agni. And thank you, everybody else, to be here. It's really cool and express my ferality and the kinds of things that I'm curious about on this Creatures project to know more about. It's really cool. I would start picking up on what Christina told you a little bit about me. So I'm a service designer and researcher who works with the topic of contradiction. And I've researched in the past contradictions of activity, contradictions of space, but currently I'm quite interested in contradictions of bodies. And what is a contradiction of body? Well, we typically know this as oppression. So there are two bodies that could be equalized, but due to some external language or structure or signs that we ascribe to these bodies, we think they are different. And some of them are superior or inferior. I'm speaking about class, gender, racism, and all kinds of differences, markers that are ascribed to these bodies that sometimes prevent these bodies from developing to their full potential. And these are collectivities that are imposed on those bodies. They usually are negative for the oppressed and positive for the oppressors. However, the oppressors also cannot get out of this and just treat everybody else as oppression was not at stake. So you're always trained to be an oppressor, even if you don't want to be one, and you have to somehow learn or unlearn to be an oppressor. And we have to find other collectivities that are interesting for all kinds of bodies. And that's the thing that I think I connect to you, because I'm researching collective bodies. And while doing so, I'm first of all looking at human association, human to human associations, but I'm also interested on more diverse collectives where you have kind of assemblage of people and other kinds of humans, other kinds of beings, other kinds of way of staying and changing the world that can join together and coalesce to transform oppressed realities. And we can think about groups, collectives, organizations, but also we could think about cultures, nations, and even nature itself as a collectivity that we can think we are part of, and maybe we can do something more wisely if we are conscious of this collectivity. So perhaps that's a start for me. So who do I choose now? Well, I'm quite curious to know more about Mika. Mika, please, can you introduce yourself?
Yes, actually, I hate this question of like you go to some strangers meeting and say, like, what do you do? And I don't really know how to explain myself as what I do. Hannah, help me. We don't hear you.
Mika and I have been collaborating since 2006 for a long time now. And I think I really liked what you said, kind of creating tears in reality. And I think for me, Mika, and my practice in e-textiles attracted me because it made a tear, it tore my reality about what technology could be, that it didn't have to be hard and encased, but that I could make it out of soft materials and I could use craft techniques that I knew how to be creative with and expressive with. And so our practice in combining electronics and textile materialities, kind of drew me into what we ended up spending a lot of time doing the last 15 years. And in this practice, something that's also been important to us is kind of documenting and sharing the things that we discover. And that also, when Agnieszka, when you talked about how to kind of collaborate together, and I feel like part of putting out our documentation into the world is because we're curious about what other people, we want to involve other minds and interests
into the things that we discover. I'm kind of just pulling from also what's just been said now. And also when I discovered this kind of non or more than human actor discourse, I had to really think that how, as a crafts practitioner, this practice of making with other materials to me feels very much like a collaboration, and not just like I'm a maker imposing my ideas onto these materials. And more I've become interested in like a self kind of reflectiveness onto how maybe it's also about using language to reframe this notions of making. And now I almost find it impossible to not think that I'm equally being remade every time we're using a new material or coming up with some new project. It's us who's also being changed in that process of creation.
Yeah, I was like thinking when I was hearing the others, like, okay, I have to say something clever or big, but I feel like we don't really have that kind of very big theme or like that, like thoughts when we start a project. And when we were reflecting on like what we have been doing, so like in the past, it was often like one thing was leading to the others, and our everyday experience of questions or something we didn't like or we wanted to level or something. These are kind of going into the project by us talking to each other and then us interacting with the others, I think. So yeah, and then I think it's probably something similar for the others, even though at the end, like it's kind of the process. So one is like we are living as a one part, like one member of the society, and we experience as a person, and that is definitely feeding us to think about something or react or reflect on something. But then of course you have a research phase, and then you have the ways to reflect it in a bigger context or bigger narrative, I guess. And I'm very curious to hear what your process of going through this, like from your personal experience to the communication to the others.
I think maybe a good like a way for us to go more in depth would be to maybe introduce a little bit more like some of the tools or like resources that each of us is using. I was thinking when Aga was talking about fermentation, like I know she runs this fermentation radio podcast, which I think is really fascinating. It's just podcast about fermentation done together with the microbes. And I realized it's just this like amazing resource of feral knowledge that can be passed to me very easily, that I can just listen to. And same like with Isabel and her altars, making altars that can be replicated by anyone who is interested in different places, and they behave differently in different spaces and places. Or this really interesting, I don't know if it was costume or way of camouflaging that Hannah and Mika did within the Human Nature Project. Or yeah, Frederick, I saw these cards that I really need to ask you at some point about your cards for the Plurality Project. But now I'm like saying too many things at once. So maybe we can follow this relay thing. We can start with, what did I say first? Aga, I said the fermentation radio first, no?
But you ask about like a methods or approaches, right? To this work. Because I was actually thinking about it, like, so what's my method? What's my approach? And I come largely from like a DIY scene. And regarding Ferment Radio podcast, I have to say when I was starting this podcast, I didn't know a bit about podcasting. I was like, hey, like I've been fermenting with other people and suddenly it's lockdown and I cannot do it. So let's talk about it. And it was already 1 year ago. And I think now I know a little bit about podcasting, but it's largely this DIY approach and kind of fake it till you make it. So it's like you record something, you see how it works. And I think that especially in podcasting, there is a lot of this pressure, like, oh, you need to have a fancy jingle and it has to be like super good sound and so on. But I think I I think usually when I work, and whether it's with podcasting or something else, I get rid of this like perfection standard, let's say, which I think is my kind of a heritage from the DIY, I think, because you don't care how it looks, or if it's aesthetic, or if it fulfills the norm. And maybe a bit more about ferment radio. So I call it that it's a podcast on social and bacterial fermentation. What I mean by that is that I take as a metaphor fermentation or anything related to microbes, anything related to the scale we cannot really see, but we might experience the effects of the activity of bacteria. And I take it as a metaphor and kind of a vehicle to talk about other things which maybe are difficult to approach, or maybe we would not think of. So actually in Ferment Radio, after 1 year of its activity, there was no single recipe for any fermented food. So this is what I mean as a metaphor. But I always say that it's something to listen to if you prepare your, I don't know, sourdough bread or whatever, to listen to, because then maybe you can experience the macro and micro at the same time. But further about those methods and approaches, of course, participation, and it's been always a very big part in what I do. And I have to say that in podcasting, I kind of suffer because yes, it is a dialogue between myself and a guest, and there is this third invisible person, which you never know what this person is thinking at the moment and what this person will say. And I find it a very challenging part of what I do right now with podcasting. And I constantly rethink like how to make it more interactive and so on and so forth. But it's in a process, it's baking, how to invite other voices in. Do I forward my the talking stick to another person, right?
I would like to jump into the discussion, if I may.
Please, please.
So I also had to adapt my creative practices for the pandemic times. And before that, I was quite excited with theater of the oppressed. And the whole thing starts with saying our bodies are mechanized by our gestures that we go through every day, the rituals, and we internalize oppression in our muscles. So in the workshop, you typically would have all kinds of exercise to spread your legs and do all kinds of things that will help you demechanize, undomesticate your body, so become more fair in a way. And how do you do that online using this very tight, narrow space that we have in online conferencing? And I was not practicing at all, and I was quite sad about this until I found a new friend. And if I may use some license here for doing a quick performance, is that all right if I do it? I would invite my friends over here. So one thing that was difficult to do in Theater of the Oppressed was to take the perspective of technologies or other than human beings. And people would feel a bit like weird by doing this. And sometimes we would lose focus, which is oppression. But using these Snapchat filters, we can definitely do this kind of things. I was in a theater session online using Snap Camera, and we pulled up this cat guy to discuss how the cat was part of a person invading private space of another person while in a shared living space. And this cat was telling from its perspective what it was like, and why spaces don't have public or private from the perspective of the cat. But for the perspective of the cat owner, definitely that was in place. And it's another one that I really love, another friend, is this one, the money talking. It's really cool because we can really bring collectiveness to speak. What's money? Money is not an individual. It's definitely something that's society speaking to us something. Typically, that you have credit in that society. But then we can really go wild with this crazy 3D beings over here. I mean, I don't want to go too much further on this, but what I want to say is that there are plenty of opportunities to appropriate and these technologies that are meant for something or doing something else. And I believe this is the spirit of feral creative practices. So turning these technologies that were once maybe designed for oppressing others and showing off how beautiful you are and modern, cooler than everybody else and privileged, you can also show otherwise, finding ways of liberating together using these kind of tools. I don't know, it's quite funny as well, I have to say. I will put in on a chat if anyone is curious to know what is this tool. It's free, you can download it. It's Snap Camera, really cool.
Yeah, I liked your phrase, finding ways of liberating together. That was really nice. I find too the whole concept of feral for me, and really the finding that there was a feral creative practices track with creatures was really liberating for me. I think as an artist, in terms of process, I tend to be my intuition never wants to be prescriptive, but I find in order to like fit into the art world and like and operate in that space, I often have to be prescriptive. And so the invitation to have a project that the outcomes were unknown, the process was given more value than even what those outcomes could be, was really felt really liberating for me and opened up the ability for myself to give myself permission to really work in a really intuitive way and see where that took me. And I think for this project, the idea and the impulse to do it was all very intuitive and pretty personal, and that's not usually the way that I work. So I just even having the feral creative practices track as something to work against and with really opened up a lot for me in terms of how I could think about my practice. And to go back also to something that Hannah was saying about being remade by the work and just thinking about all the ways that we can be feral and collaborate with the other creatures we're trying to work with or think about. Part of my project of making these wild altars was creating light sculptures that are made out of beeswax. I really like working with the beeswax. It helps me feel a little bit of that collaboration, like I'm somehow in conversation with the bees. I'm also very scared of like wasps and all bee type things, although I respect them very much and know how important they are. And whenever I'm working with the beeswax, I melt it in my garage, and there are zillions of pollinators all over Los Angeles, and it summons them to come to my studio space because they smell the melting wax. So it's this constant process of me like melting some wax, working on a sculpture, getting very terrified because there's like 20 bees swarming around me and having to leave and come back. So that was just a pretty funny case as well, where I actually really was in conversation with these other species when I was working on these sculptures, and just interesting to reflect on why I have that response and why I'm fearful of them. And so that was really really interesting for me. But the process, I think, has been different for this project, just in that ability to not be so prescriptive and let go of the feeling like I'll control the work and what happens to it once it's out in the world. My sculptures are in like a very public space right now. They're collecting leaves and petals. And I went to check on it the other day, and one of them had like rolled down the set of stairs that it was on, and having the sort of freedom of mind to let that be has been really interesting and fun and feels really exciting creatively.
You should pass the stick, Isabel.
Who haven't we heard from? Maybe I'll pass it to Hannah and Mika.
Okay, maybe I start. So the question is the method, process, and tools. So we use a textile technique with electronics, and it started off by kind of meeting this textile that are metallized or otherwise it's conductive. And then we started to kind of mix it or use it as a part of the electronics and experimenting. But also at that time, we didn't know electronics and technology so well. So this was also a way that made us easy to kind of understand what's going inside of these technologies that we didn't know how exactly it's working otherwise. And then we started to share this information with the others. And what was really nice for me was at least to kind of this kind of feeling of empowerment that you understand technology. It's not something that is given or something that is in the black box, but you really know exactly how it's working. And then also you notice that when the others also start to understand, then there is a new idea comes from, or a new critique comes from them. And I think this was for me the process, or for me the method of using textile and craft technique is the way for me to really understand and have kind of control over technology, maybe. Hannah, do you have more to
add? Just what you just said, I'm thinking, but but I'm wondering, it's control over technology, but it's some kind of also, for me, it's like relating to technology through.
Yeah, maybe that's more, control is maybe not right.
Yeah, because to some extent, I even almost consider this kind of textile technology, because it's often less stable, unpredictable, delicate, that one has to be more okay with having less control over it. And that's kind of a nice lesson to learn from working with it, is that you, on the one hand, become more and more curious, why is it not working, and have to understand more and more about the materials. It's not about being like, okay, I can't know, I just have to live with it not working. That's not what I mean, but understanding that it's at a material level, something is happening that's making it unreliable, or that every time you fold it, it doesn't return back to the same state. And then knowing that because that's the material property, you can make the decision that you're okay with to work with that material's property, or if it's not stable enough for what you need, to look for something else.
Yeah, like often like materials and technique you're using is leading you to the direction that you didn't think so much, or just kind of let it go in a way. And then it's not that you don't have a control, like, okay, control is probably really not a good word to describe, but how do you say, I didn't predict or imagine that it's going in that way, but you kind of let it go, like, okay, it's the shape it wants to hold, or it's the material that wants to do that. And then it's also very interesting to let it happen and experiment to succeed or fail, I find.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and to some extent, I also become more and more interested in kind of getting lost in making. So really setting out with the material, not knowing where we're going to land, and kind of taking it as a journey. And when I'm teaching these days, I've started using the journey analogy, because I find people can relate to this idea of you're just going traveling, you're going backpacking, you've got 1 month, but you don't know what you're going to experience or exactly where you're going to go. It's not this idea of we've got a semester and we're going to build a project and I'm going to know what I want to make and then I'm going to try to make it. But you kind of set out for this time and you often travel together. And then the end, what you have is you have all these stories and experiences of where you've been and who you've met. And the stories are kind of what you bring back and continue telling throughout your life.
That's so nice. I think now I would like to, if you can help us think through one of the things from the perspective of our project. It's been kind of important to think about that, since we are kind of in a troublesome space now, kind of almost heading to all kinds of difficult collapses, or if not, we are in the middle of various different ones, extractivism and biodiversity loss and all kinds of different challenges of of different magnitude. We are one of the central questions of our project is to try to understand how it is as we as creative practitioners, and we have a very kind of wide understanding of what it is. So it's just like artists and but also citizens doing things together, and different kinds of. There's a variety of things to look at. But how through creative engagement we can together think ways of not necessarily solving the problem, but like understanding where we are. And I think a lot of your projects, deal with that question. Would you be able to say a few words about how do you think these kinds of engagements that you are kind of inviting others to join you with, like Isabel has let's think about new rituals and create these altars, and Agnieszka has this idea about talking or thinking with the spirulina about what kinds of awful things colonization and extractivism has brought to us, and Frederick has been questioning this idea about like how could we liberate ourselves together, both oppressors and the oppressed. How do you think that this kind of the creative engagements you are working with, what they do in the world differently than, let's say, just the other approach we have been using also, that's like, let's give people information so they make informed decisions. What do you think would be different or important?
If I may comment on how do I approach anything from a collective perspective, you just look at the history of things, because things are never there because you have chosen. There was definitely some ancestors in your family, or at least generations of humans and other kinds of beings who had prepared Earth and all these kind of details which are part of Earth to make that thing happen. And I think respect starts from that. So you acknowledge all the effort that has been done by all these entities for you to be there. And also you acknowledge oppression that can have done in the that can have happened in the past, might not be in place, but still it's still influencing the relationship. So some of these entities will have more access than others to resources and to opportunities. Some of them will be more flashy, other will be look like outdated. And while we are in our creative practices, we might make choices based on what is currently being hyped and what is fashionable. And sometimes these will not acknowledge that history, because most of the times, if what is fashionable is the oppressor's opinion, and the oppressor's opinion wants to hide the history from the oppressed, so that they do not get revolted, they do not question the oppressive structures that are still in place. And I think that regarding the main problem you addressed, Andrea, about climate change and a possible catastrophes in our planet, then we have to make sure that we consider the oppression that humans exact of other kinds of beings, which I like to call it a speciesism. And but I don't want to just focus on livestock animals, because I think plants that are also, and all kinds of beings are also suffering from prioritizing human beings over other beings, and doing this kind of anthropocentric designs, human-centered designs, so to speak, or humanism. So we have definitely to think of post-humanism that does not fall prey to the same oppressive structures that humanism had cultivated since 500 years ago. We should not forget that colonization is based on these humanist ideas that there are some humans that are better than others, and there are some beings that might not even be humans. That's why they need to be colonized and domesticated. So decolonizing starts from understanding history and being critical, and also trying to do otherwise and create something which is more feral, I would say.
Yeah, if I can jump in and build or follow that thread. Thank you for sharing that, Frederick. I think that working, to me, from my personal practice, working with microbes also made me think, how much do I impose the story and human and my perspective on those organisms?
Can't hear Agnieszka.
I think we probably lost Agnieszka to the spirulina.
It was the cyano automaton.
Yeah,
Sure.
we're probably fill the gap by this spirulina talking to us.
Feedback.
My
Here we
internet
back.
didn't manage. Excuse me.
Yes, good, you're back.
Just to follow up the thought, so it is very tricky to do not impose our own understanding of, how humans are on other species. And for me, working, for example, with spirulina is also the same. Oh, spirulina will tell the story, but how will they tell the story? Like me. So it's very tricky ground, and to me, it's a struggle in this kind of practice. But there's also another thing. It's amazing to be all together, but I also have a feeling that we talk to the like-minded people, or informed, and how we come out and how we talk to other people, which we could challenge our own ideas with, and we could also be challenging to those people. So those are the two questions which I leave basically open, but they are very important to me in a practice like that to keep in mind and explore.
I would say, just to add to the fermentation practice, and how can this process change this like self-understanding of a human in this creative process? It's in a way it's so like can be like quite simple. I remember a few weeks ago when I was fermenting my water kefir, and I simply didn't have time to take care of it as I should, which is like, you should change the sugar water for the kefir grains every 4 days or so. And because I was too busy with doing other work, I didn't do it. So it stayed there for too long. And I almost killed the grains, which then was reflected in the next batch of the kefir, made me really sick because I didn't take care of the grains properly. And then kind of there is some aspect of humility that you like realize, okay, this is not fun. This is not like you need to care. And you need to do it persistently, or you need to commit, or you need to leave, because like this other partner in this food practice is like, they have a say as well. It's not just about me. It's not about me making some food. It's bigger than me, actually. Or yeah.
Maybe this is a nice it connects to me something that Isabel said in the beginning about creating experiences for people, and it sounds like what you had was an experience with the material, and that allows you to, being sick is definitely using your body to understand something. And just a comment.
To me, like, this is really everyday kind of like example of what we can, or what one can imagine as feral, like both the positive and negative aspects of what feral could mean. Like on one hand, there is this thing beyond my control, this microbial process that usually really takes a good care of my guts, and it's something that is working for my benefit. But if there is a slight change, it suddenly starts being sort of toxic, and it just completely changes, like, how does it work for me, or within my small universe that I'm living in locally. So that's this very that's this like balancing on the feral line of, okay, things are out of our control, which is really exciting and surprising, and there is a level of uncertainty from which possibly new knowledge can come, but also possibly some kind of danger or risk is in there. Yeah, but I like this ambivalence of doing this like, yeah, experimental work.
Yeah, I think for me, the notion of trying to bring someone else into a feral place seems to be like at the heart of some of these methods. And the question too about like, how do we speak to those, how do we reach outside of the echo chamber of who else is already informed? I think that's a question that's also really important to my practice, and trying to reach outside of those circles, the groups, the folks that we come into contact with in our day-to-day schedule. And I think that for me, I have found, and I'm always testing this, I'm always trying to find new ways to do this, but an experiential opportunity, or creating an experience or creating an emotional affect in someone, has seemed to be slightly more successful in doing that than trying to tell someone something. And I think that it's funny too, thinking about the fermentation and working with the microbes. When I was taking some notes before our talk today, just sort of brainstorming answers to some of these questions, and I was trying to define for myself what feral is. And something that came to mind is the part of us as humans that's more like being a microbe than it is like being a person in a mall or a scholar or any of these like pretty human hats that we wear. Like, how can we get to a place where we feel more feral, and how could my creative practice or a project that I'm putting out into the world maybe bring someone else into that place as well? And for me, it's trying to call upon those invisible collaborations that we have at any moment. Like when you're walking outside, how can you get someone to actually notice that they couldn't breathe without the plants that are nearby them? And it sounds pretty simple when saying it out loud, but I think it's pretty hard to do in practice. So always trying to find a method or use something in the creative project to call upon those parts of people that are often forgotten when we're so living in our head and in our cognitive space rather than in a bodily space. So that's why I think for me, as much as I also love working in digital spaces, there's something about calling upon someone's feeling, their senses that aren't vision, that aren't thinking, that maybe hopefully it's a hypothesis at this point, but I think I'm always working with that hypothesis. What can those moments do, even if they're momentary? Because I also think about scale, the very feral like human body scale of the moment to moment experience, and how those are what constitute our reality. So if you can chip away at those momentary experiences, perhaps someone's perspective about their own reality can shift. But then bringing feral to a larger scale and using open source structures and formats of collaborative thinking, I think are also really important. So I think for me, those methods and practices are like bringing people into a feral place where they're relating to other organisms and their own day-to-day experience, but then also creating feral structures that can help drive activity in a larger way. And yeah, it's so great to be here with all of you folks and the discussion we're having and all that you're thinking about, because it's definitely drawing up a lot of inspiration and questions in my mind. And it's very, yeah, I just wanted to shout out to everyone else. All of your practices and thoughts are really making a lot move for me. So thank you.
There's a philosophical question behind what Isabel is thinking on these feral places. Typically and biologically, maybe people will define feral places as places that have been touched by human culture, or that human culture has gone away and now it's recovering. However, this would reproduce this opposition between nature and culture, which I think this kind of art we are talking about is really trying to overcome. Because I don't think we are talking about humans as outside of nature here. So we are speaking a certain level of collaboration that it's not just we and nature. I think we are nature, but we may have lost the contact with the nature we have in us. And I think this whole process of acknowledging the history of materials and the history of other living beings is also a way of understanding our own histories and how we have domesticated ourselves. It's not just we domesticate other living beings, and we also lost somehow our ferality in this process. And while doing so, we lost something that we might like if we let it go. And I think these feral places that we may create and feral practices, they might help us again to liberate from this domestication that somehow oppress our groups. And sometimes some people might benefit more from this than others, but it doesn't matter. It will definitely be, I would say it's definitely bad for humanity in general, being away from nature and from some instincts and deep desires and the willingness to be part of this wholeness, which is nature. And I think we are getting to a moment where art can really definitely push us forward to ask questions in this regard and not just be like complaining or being in a negative mood about the Anthropocene and we are going to end the civilization and so on. And we're going to destroy nature. Come on, we are nature. we are part of it. If you have a problem, you also have the solution.
But I don't think it's about distinguishing ourselves from nature. I think it's very much about finding ways to create these associations and these relations, which is very hard. I mean, there are, even if you think the way we relate to other humans, it's so difficult to empathize and to think yourself from the perspective of another human, let alone to think like from the perspective, to think the world from the perspective of a microbe or a plant. So it's not really about, acknowledging that we are all part of nature, but it's about how can we find ways that can help us relate to all these other, beings. And maybe I would like to go back a little bit to like Paula's question about, coming across as like cryptic and if crypticity is a problem. So I was wondering also, Paula, if you want to say something about this, because I also see this a lot in a lot of these discussions, that they are very much not, well, they're quite inaccessible to a lot of people. So maybe...
No, I was just a little bit kind of like putting into writing what I understood from Andrea's question and that adding there another word of descripticity. But I don't, I just wanted to hear you more about all of you, about this, how you see this. And so, I'd rather hear, and I'm liking the idea of hearing, if briefly, if possible, this take on the definition, the self-definition of feral. I think that adds to opening up this, and in the process of opening up, then maybe it's easier also to discuss with others that are less informed or involved, or
Yeah, I was also not very familiar with the word of the use of feral in this way, and I was trying to kind of think by also when I was listening to you, and when Isabel, you said the human is almost like bacteria, or like I feel like maybe we are. I mean, we are bacteria, maybe in a way, and a type of, and then maybe also our behavior is in a way feral, maybe. And I wonder, when you use the feral place, is it like this particular place, or actually like everywhere we are is also feral places and we are feral beings, but we just do not see it that way? And is it just a matter of discovering our nature, how we are, as defining it feral rather than tamed or domesticated?
Yeah, I think For me, it's that we all have that ferality, if that's the right word, like within ourselves, sort of as Frederick was saying, it's there, it's buried. Maybe we've been domesticated to not be in tune with it, but maybe that's a very loose translation of the word feral for me, but that we are all creatures, just like all of these other creatures we are talking about now, creating relationships with and noticing our creatures, and that there is something unifying in all of us, sort of underneath maybe our human cognition, that we could go there within ourselves if we have the right tools, or if we try, and not so much like a physical geographic place, but more an emotional or a mental place, like within, maybe a spiritual place, maybe it's not mental, and trying to access that. And as you were speaking, Nika, it also made me think about it. To me, the word feral, I have a positive association with that, but it occurred to me that there might not often be a positive association with the word feral. So how do you also communicate that maybe that's a place we want to go, rather than avoid? Yeah, Andre, feral can also go very wrong.
Yeah, I was wondering, is it actually the place you want to go, or like a state you want to achieve? And then also, like me, like single person is one thing, but also as a society, like many humans together, it's like as if this culture is growing in a petri dish in a way, which we don't know actually what's going to happen as a whole. So, and then thinking of that, like, is it something we want to have?
내가 만약에 지금부터 한국말로 뭔가를 말했을 때 그러면 아무도 나를 이해 못하겠죠? And I just spoke in Korean. And I think that's the thing, like, communicate what in what language. I think that's really important. And language itself, as a magic then, as it's been written about, alphabet is very different magic to, say, Korean, and how it sounds, and the multisensory nature of how we communicate is very different culturally as well. So I think maybe crypticness is also embedded in that, but at the same time, I don't know. As a society, can we be fair? I think everybody is. We're sort of trained to not think of it that way. And if you go back to the statement, are we all bacteria or viruses? About 8%, up to 8% of our human genome is viruses. And if we take the notion that we are all holobionts, because we are, and if you just believe in sciences, they'll actually tell you, yes, we are holobionts. So then how do we define anything? Because I don't exist as a soul being, an individual being. The rationalist thinking just has to go out of the box. Then I think that's feral, though. If you can't pinpoint something or define something, it sort of becomes feral within the power structure, I suppose, within where we live. And that's kind of interesting for me, because then we talk about experience. Every experience becomes an experiment in that sense. And through that, we're learning to mutate. And that's the sole way of survival. And for me, it sort of makes sense that we are all kind of feral to start with. Sorry, just go back to what you said, individually or collectively, because we're all collective anyway.
We lost Jazz also after the Korean
Feral waves.
feral wave. Yeah.
Yeah, no, sorry, go on.
I think she has a point on language being something that makes us differentiate from ourselves, and we can be apart from each other, but also we can be close together. And if we find shared languages, I think feral place should definitely have some kind of languages that we can relate. And I think maybe language is also kind of a context, which is important for this conversation. And not just spoken language, but any kinds of languages, even but I don't know, chemical language, if that's possible to extend the concept further.
I mean, it can be related to the type of languages that we are using across different like fields and disciplines where we also often don't understand each other really good. But also in like what Jess, how she was speaking, how she spoke Korean, it was an interesting experience trying to translate the feral creative practices track into Czech. It's impossible. It's impossible to do it in a way that you just don't sound like it doesn't make any sense, really. And we were asked to do interviews for radios in Czech and write something, and it always started with, please, can you tell me what the hell is feral? It's just, what's going on? Like how, and then you realize like how so many words just don't work in some languages, in some contexts, or they work completely differently, and it changes the whole meaning. And yeah, understanding.
Yeah, yes, I really like that you said that maybe we start feral, and in this case, then is it the language that is leading us to go out of that phase?
Mika and Hannah, you said in the beginning also something like that we use language to remake the notions of making. And I was wondering if you can talk a little bit more about that, since we are in the language part of the discussion. I think it was something that Hannah said while talking about your practice.
Yeah, I think, and so it comes up for me with this notion that when I'm making, I'm actually collaborating with the materials, and to kind of reframe my perspective on things that I've been doing for a long time and thinking of it in a different way. But then also before the panel, Mika and I were briefly talking also about the term feral, and how I see it also as it's a new term that I'm seeing popping up, and I mean, it's not a new word, but in this context, I feel like it's been being brought in as a means of then being able to create a new practice around it. And then I feel like a panel like now is in part trying to define what is it now that we want to. This word is providing us with an opportunity to change things. And somebody else was talking about change in the beginning. And yeah, and then the question is like, what do we want to change?
I think Hannah's baby has an interesting take on language, because I think we are overly reliant on these codified languages, and especially verbal articulated language according to a predefined code. However, human beings can do much more than that. And I think other beings can also all kinds of different noises and communicate through body language, and definitely must explore more of these ways of communicating. And there are also some very interesting theater of the pressed games on communicating through animal language, and trying to find people that somehow, so you start on a random noise and then you have to find a mate. It's also doing some kind of similar noises, and then you would adjust noises, and then you have to also communicate through body language, and then to figure out whose animal is that one. And I think these expressions that I miss from the now with the video conferencing is something that we definitely have to find through other ways, like I previously mentioned on this augmented reality app. But there's definitely technology enables to deal with many different kinds of languages. But if we just stick to applying and sticking to the code, like I was saying in the beginning, and just speaking what other people would understand. No, we have to somehow create language. That means we might not be understood in the first place.
I think that Surabi is making a nice point that it's also like we don't need to just stick with one language, like you said. There's like many ways of communicating, might be also part of the virality of it.
But contrarily, if we didn't learn, or if we didn't know the language, then are we free to think more, or we cannot think anything?
Now we go very philosophical, Mika. Very.
I like the proposal of like, yeah, exploring different ways of communicating. And I often wonder about spoken language and what's come up too, this idea of like a head heavy or a thought heavy engagement versus like more using our body and other senses and understandings more. I wonder if spoken language is that very head heavy, or is it also, I mean, our vocal cords and all that, that's not our head, that's kind of spreading into our bodies and resonant bodies. And sign language, or other people use, then they extend their body to be able to communicate if they can't use their vocal cords. But still, somehow I often think of, yeah, written and spoken languages we have as being responsible for so much of our stuff concentrating in our head.
I really like the background that you are always having, Hannah, for like, it's like if you have synchronized it, you know, whatever you say, like your creature always gives it like really nice context. So like, let me show you in practice how it looks. Here you go. But maybe to ask slightly different question, to follow with that kind of questions that we were brainstorming about previously. We were thinking about these feral ways of learning and feral ways of teaching. And that starts with the resources, how can we share them and how can we pass them and reuse them? How can we use each other's altars, cards, costumes, things like that. But I was also curious, and especially with you, Hannah, because I know that you are teaching and we were talking about your students before, like if there is a way how to replicate or use this feral ways of knowing and learning within the, like, really like the teaching practice, with, you know, working with students, like this idea of not having things under control fully and like leaving there some kind of a space for surprise. And that can be questioned to anyone actually who is teaching, right? Not just to one.
I like to use this concept of anthropophagy, or cultural cannibalism, that is has a tradition here in Brazil since the indigenous people ate the Portuguese once they arrived in our coast. And this has developed into a more like sophisticated approach on dealing with foreign ideas and foreigners, and trying to somehow relate what is coming from the outside to what is already in the inside in a much honorable way. So this kind of practice, cultural cannibalism, wasn't mean to be savage. It was really an appreciation for the other so much that you would like to, for the other to be part of yourself. And we somehow stimulate our students to relate to colonialist designs and colonialist technologies in this pretty much way. So they try to put yourself in the work so that you transform while creating that stuff, and or creating the interaction, or somehow creating other people's lives, and then you make those people's lives yours. And that may be also something to extend further to other living beings, although I don't have so much experience on that. I know that some amoebas have this strange thing of eating some other kind of bacteria and not digesting that bacteria, because the bacteria can do something for the amoeba while it's lurking around. And I think this kind of symbiosis might come up from anthropophagic practices.
Christina has a good point in the chat. Is this a relationship, human relationship, or more than human relationship with food in general?
No, it's making something part of us. No, and this is, I think, also how when we always think about, yeah, what do you eat and how you become basically what you eat. So I've always think that, yeah, our relationship with food is so much more than just the functional thing of like, it's really about nurturing ourselves and becoming the food that we eat. And we are very much related to that and where this food comes from and what it is and how we consume it and, you know, how we make it enter our body.
I find it super fascinating, but I will try not to say anything because it will take too long. No, but this idea of transforming ourselves through food, and it's like, you know, this everyday mode of like self-modification or becoming transhuman or something, like just sculpting yourself, both your body shape and mental shape and everything that is related to it. I find it really interesting, especially because its relation to culture.
What if this is done by someone else, by someone who you do not trust, and that you may not know that's doing this to you? I'm thinking about, for example, algorithm designers in social networking or policymakers somehow shaping the way we are in our everyday lives without us even knowing what's going on.
Yeah, I was a little bit obsessed again in this context with like the use of algorithms or like smart technologies in the food context again. Like, how do you trust, you know, all these like smart kitchen tools that they will make a food for you that is like safe, that is okay? How do you trust your smart oven that can set the temperature and cooking or baking time and baking, like, you know, style for you, and you are just supposed to push the button and then you should trust it? And it reminded me of this trust that you should have when you're a kid, that you probably kind of have maybe unconsciously to your mother who is feeding you. So suddenly this smart food technology becomes some sort of mother that you should trust, that it will cook, it will feed you well, and, you know, it will not harm you. But I don't know how feral this uncertainty is. But anyway, we are actually we have like 10 minutes left, and we have had some questions in the chat, but please also anyone feel free to ask any questions you might have out loud or comment or do anything you like. Well, I see that there are questions in the chat. Yeah, what about eating in a restaurant? Yeah, it's a good question. They are supposed to believe the system, no? Like, same as if you buy food in a supermarket, like if you buy anything that you didn't grow in your garden, but then again, what is the soil that you are using? So like, yeah.
I think a feral practice would be, let's just eat and see what happens. I wouldn't say that a feral people, they would be like very protective. I would say they would be more adventurous in what they would try. However, of course, it's always a risk. But I have the feeling that being feral is taking more risks. If I'm not wrong. What do you think, actually?
Do you need to believe in anything? Like, I don't know. Like, can you just eat whatever comes your way? I mean, that's my philosophy anyway. But I learned that it is actually a term that exists in Buddhism, polite vegetarianism, that you would prefer to eat vegetables or vegetarian food, but when non-vegetarian food comes your way, you eat it so as to honor the work that's gone into it, the lives it took, and the impact it might have by not eating it. So maybe we don't have to believe in anything. We just kind of take whatever comes.
Now we went to a really funny place. Said, woo!
I think for me, there's something interesting about feral that when we think about our relationships with more than humans, we're trying to really change those, but we're sort of having to like invite people to have an experience with us with old language and then shift them through experience and then sort of seed the new language through the experience. And feral sort of feels like a good term to describe that process of change where you're sort of cannibalizing the ground beneath your feet at the same time as sort of adding new ground. Like what a tricky position to sort of be, yeah, like excavating ahead of you and then building the path and sort of shifting yourselves and shifting people at the same time. And then also, I think, go into one of the feral kind of creative practice tools really showed me that quite a lot of the core of what we're trying to do when we invite people to think with or be with more than human others, actually we are reaching for something kind of similar, and even just having the feral track and exchanging little pieces of language and understanding and building a community around that feels like a really important way to understand how to do that change better. So I think it's really helped me to, yeah, understand more about what others are doing and understand the difficulties of that feral mode of change and try to build more ways to help each other to invite people better and differently.
Yeah, I like the parallel of like eating food as like acquiring the language is also like eating food almost, and then taking it to you, and then you do new things. And I'm gonna just put it back a little bit to this practice of making something. So when we are making things, and then if we don't know how to do certain techniques of craft or circuitry or something, we go sometimes learn by someone who actually knows how to do this particular craft technique. And by learning this thing and then starting to use this new technique, also our thought or like imagination or what we can do changes. And then like we are doing different things from when we didn't know this language of making something. And yeah, that, and then I think that has been a big drive for what I have been doing. And then I wanted to kind of also throw this question to Isabel and Agnieszka, because I think, I'm not sure if you knew from beginning how to work with these bio techniques, or if not, I wonder how that impacted on what you do, or like how you think and how you reflect artistically.
For me, feral practice is about the professionalization. So it's questioning professional, first of all, because it comes from the mindset of, well, long to talk, but we can all imagine where it came from. So from basically creating capital of certain professions. And to me, it's always about questioning that, and it's never about going deep into one discipline. So let's say now I will become a specialist in microbiology of cyanobacteria. I am not interested in that. I'm interested in developing the connections. So I serve on the surface, but I make the joints, but I will never go deep. So if you ask me, no, I didn't know anything about how to grow the spirulina at home. I killed some survived, and we keep going. I don't know if they will, stay here with me for long, but yeah, it's about that for me.
Did you know what you're going to do with this technique from beginning, or did it shift?
More or less, I have to say that step by step, it was simplifying. I had much more complicated idea at first, but then I was just dropping all the elements to come to the most simplest version of what I was planning. So it's kind of this becoming feral in this case was becoming simpler and simpler.
That's nice. That's actually simpler is feral. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, really similarly for me, it kind of in serendipity ended up working with beeswax at one point for something, and I honestly can't even remember how it started, but just over the last maybe like 4 or 5 years, there's no model, you know, I wasn't looking at like, oh, this person makes beeswax sculptures in this way. It was very experimental and just testing and seeing what happened and letting it evolve really organically. And I think as well, that was like for me, a very feral practice, and letting the material lead me and sort of just seeing what happened. Each time I've worked on these forms, they completely shift and change. And I try to see how I can extend the material a little bit more, but it's a constant learning process. And I agree with Agnieszka, like I tend not to go deep into anything, and I'm always trying to learn new skills and test new. That's much more exciting and fun for me to be in a space of not knowing and teaching myself how to do something. And sometimes I think I'd be a little better off if I could just like stick to something and learn it really well, but it's not quite as fun. So.
And what's the new language that you're going to acquire next? Do you have an idea?
I've been trying to learn Touch Designer. So it's learning some of these more like visual programming, creative coding sort of things that I know nothing about. So that's right now I've been dabbling, and that's been very fun. If anyone knows how to use it well, let's talk.
I just want to say that being more feral wouldn't go against being more human or being more into culture or art, because I think that this idea of culture being equals to domestication is maybe one of the possibilities for a culture, a human culture, and a very restricted one, I would say, that being very polite and accepting orders and taking information as knowledge and truth and not questioning, accepting. This is just one kind of culture, and maybe one kind of culture we want to let it go, or at least show that there's alternatives through feral practices. So I would say that we are maybe more humans if we think that thinking freely and liberating ourselves is the natural state of humans. And that's also the natural state for cultures. If we band these together, I think feral practice is really about overcoming this dichotomy between nature and culture, and being naturally, culturally human.
It's a fantastic wrap-up point from Frederick, almost. You have the opportunity for other. I think that Anne was also making a couple of wrap-up points in the chat that are interesting, as like the temporal quality to the feralness and this like avoiding dichotomies. I think it's also kind of important for us to remember in regarding to creatures. So I thank you very much for that reminder.
I have to say that, like, listening to these definitions of like how do we benefit from these practices that are open-ended, and Agnieszka and Isabel describing how the point is not to have a strict plan and come to perfection. Tying it back to creatures, it would be so lovely if we are able to translate it to language that would be understandable by our evaluators and our reviewers, because it's not. It seems like we in this chat all kind of know what we are talking about, but it's not so easy to translate it to everyone. That you just need to go with open-ended plan and believe that something interesting will come out of it. And it usually does, but you can't provide any assurances at the beginning of the research. But yeah, not widely acceptable yet, I guess. Hopefully soon. But yeah, we are actually out of time. So I'm supposed to actually start wrapping up and saying that we should slowly stop. So I guess that maybe at this point, thank you everyone really again for joining, to all the panelists, co-moderators, co-creature, co-conspirators, Uroborosians, the audience here, audience at the stream. Thanks for joining us at this, whatever crazy hour is that for you. It turned out that it's crazy hour for many of us. So thanks again for rolling with us. And yeah, if you would have any like further questions, you can either send email to the festival email address, or there is also this Discord chat that is advertised on the festival website, which is open in a longer term. So you can also reach out to anyone over there, or make smoke signals, send pigeons, I don't know, anything you like, whatever communication transfer element you like. But yeah, thank you again, everyone. And I think we can probably stop the stream.